Hello, my beautiful friends. Welcome to episode 9 of your viewer submissions. These are the stories that you send to me and I share with our true crime fam. As always, thank you so much to everybody who submits a story, even if it's not a story that gets read on the channel. For you to trust me with it, it means the world to me. And I hope you know how incredible you are allowing yourself to be vulnerable to share these experiences with others. Right now, I have over 600 in my email. So when I start to feel a little bit better, I've had this cold, cough, nastiness for a few weeks now. I'm just wanting to get that dealt with, and then I think I'm going to start doing 2 of these a week. In addition to the True Crime Wine Wednesday, that's not going anywhere. Oh, and I just have to shout out my girl Chris over at Modern Métis. You guys, look at these little custom earrings that she made me. She surprised me with them, and I didn't think I could be more obsessed with something till I saw these. If you haven't checked her out already, go and do so over on Instagram. She is Modern Métis. Her name's Chris. Tell her I sent you. All right, let's get started. All right, our first story says, "Hi Sherilyn, you know who I am and how much I love and adore you. I never thought I'd be putting this out there, but I think a lot of young girls need to hear this. Growing up, my family and I lived next door to another family which consisted of a husband, a wife, 2 daughters, and 1 son. Trigger warning, this story contains sexual assault of a child. I was 9 years old when the father next door started molesting me. He would ask if I wanted to go to get candy, and I'd always say yes, and although I didn't think it was right, every time he asked, I went. It stopped when I was 12. I never told anyone, and he always told me if I did tell, no one will believe you. I kept this in for many years and ended up an addict. I'm clean now, but when I started seeing a private psychiatrist, he told me because I blocked it out and never told anyone, that's probably why I started using drugs. I kept wanting to block it out as if it never happened." This is so important to share. I know that it's hard to be vulnerable and talk about these things, but the statistics of people who become addicts, who suffered some form of abuse in their life, the correlation between the two is just staggering. I knew it wasn't my fault, but I still had shame and guilt, and we continued being neighbors until I was 18. Oh my gosh. His oldest daughter and I were friends, and I actually ended up telling her what her dad had done to me when we were talking years later. I'll be 52, and I told her when I was around 39. Oh my gosh, that is a long time to keep that in. When I told her, she told me her dad sexually abused her throughout her teenage years, and I just couldn't believe what she was telling me. She also told no one and went on like life was normal, and it wasn't. As far as his daughter goes, she's good, and we still talk. For me, I wasn't that lucky because I never told for so many years. I ended up self-medicating for a long time. Now I'm good, and I still see a therapist till this day. There was nothing wrong with that, girl. I'm sure you have a lot of stories to tell that are way worse than mine, but I just don't want these young girls to ever think that it's their fault and to please tell somebody. I guess I could have turned out a lot worse, but now that I've dealt with it and I've learned to cope, my life is a whole lot better. Rachel. Thank you so much for sharing. The reason I wanted to share this story is there are many in my inbox that are similar, many that come from people who sent them that don't even want me to read them. They just want to talk about it. And I want anybody watching who can resonate with this to know you are not alone. No matter where that situation led you in your life, if it's something that you might not be proud of, there's hope, there's help, and it's not your fault. Thank you so much for sending that in, Rachel. All right, the second story says, "Hi Sherilyn, hope you're having an incredible day and that you got some great snuggles in with Clout Baby and the rest of the fam. Thanks for sharing my previous story on your episode. You of course did it so much justice in your retelling, and I definitely laughed at the commentary. For anyone wondering, I'm the mom who took her kid to a murderer's house, and don't worry, that only happened once. This story is a little bit more intense, and I'm having to leave out some identifying details, but it's a wild one, so I think people will be fascinated despite not being able to look into it as easily. This was years ago, and I had a job in an office that handled real estate transactions at the time. While I wasn't the receptionist, my desk was in the front lobby, so I interacted with most of the clients that came in. One day, a tall, thinner man, around 35 to 40 years old, who was selling a piece of property came in to sign the deed and receive his money. in the form of a check for the sale. He brought with him a child that appeared to be between the ages of 4 and 6, dressed in boys' clothes with long curly brown hair. They didn't seem out of the ordinary really, beyond the fact that the child's clothes were brand new and still had the sticker style tag on the backside of their shorts. I made pleasant conversation about their planned move to Honduras following the sale until the person who would be signing documents with them became available. Because sitting around quietly while someone else is signing a ton of paperwork is pretty hard for young children, I kept crayons at my desk, and I offered to let the little one sit with me in the lobby and color while the man did his signing. The man responded, "I don't know if he'll want to stay out here," while giving the kiddo a strange look. The little one was all too happy to sit beside me at my desk and enjoy the crayons, and so he proceeded to the signing area while I kept an eye on the kiddo. After a few minutes of coloring, I finally decided to chat with the little one since I didn't have much else going on. I asked them what their name was, and they said, "I'm supposed to tell you to call me," oh, this is a name I can't pronounce and I don't want to mess it up. Emelina? I'm so sorry. Wild way to answer that, but okay. And we kept talking. After a few minutes, this child, who remember appears not to be more than 6 years old, looks around my desk, spots the picture of my children, and asks if they're mine. I say, yes, they are. And then I hear, "They are very beautiful and handsome. You should hide them so no one steals them." Okay, now that's really weird, and what strange words for such a young child, but I'm trying to stay calm. "No one is going to steal them, silly," I announced, trying to laugh off the creepy feeling I suddenly have. "Oh yes, they will. Someone stole me." Chills. What did this kid just say to me? They were still engrossed with their coloring, so I attempted some more small talk so they weren't alerted to my panic while I hurriedly went online to the Center for Missing and Exploited Children's website. Oh my gosh, you are brilliant. Again, this is why I'm not in these situations. Actually, now I do feel like I'd be more prepared in the situations because of all of you sharing them. I feel like my panic factor would have been going off. After a few minutes of scrolling, I found a picture of a little girl who had been missing for about 2 years. Oh my gosh, you are brilliant. They were identical, but just to make sure my mind wasn't playing tricks on me, I grabbed a few coworkers and motioned them to look from the screen to this happily coloring child in an effort to verify. When the fourth person agreed completely, I went back to the closing room, told my boss I needed to speak with him urgently. "Before you're done signing," I specifically said. My boss followed me out of the room, and I brought the situation to his attention. At first, he wasn't inclined to get involved, but after a few moments of hesitation, agreed to call someone he knew to get some instructions on how to handle it. When he got off the phone, he said the seller had some unrelated warrants, so the police were on their way to pick him up and sort it out. My boss also said that we had been told to try to keep him talking, but to not prevent him from leaving. The office was in a high-rise building, and we were near the top floor. But there was a business on the ground level that I knew that gave away free popcorn, so I hatched a plan to try to get the kiddo downstairs and milling about as long as possible to buy time. The man agreed to allow me to take the little one downstairs and grab some free popcorn. We played on the escalators, rode the elevator up and down, stopped on every floor to use the random water fountains, and even got the stupid popcorn, but the police still hadn't arrived. Finally, my boss called my cell phone and told me to come back up as we were out of time and the man was now ready to leave. As we entered my office, the elevator doors opened behind us and out rushed 5 or 6 uniformed police officers. Pandemonium ensued. The kid grabbed my hand and bolted to one of the back offices, hiding under a desk. I slammed and locked the door behind us, crawling under the desk to comfort the kiddo, who by this time had confirmed to me that she was in fact a little girl. The man tried to escape by running out our office kitchen, planning to jump out the window. The windows on that level didn't open, and upon realizing he was cornered, grabbed the microwave and threw it at the officers. After much screaming and what I assume was resisting, I was still under the desk for the most part, the man was finally arrested. A kindly woman from CPS coaxed the little girl out from under the table to a safe place while everything was sorted out. A few weeks later, the check we had given the man for his sale was returned to us as non-payable because the prison had endorsed it improperly and applied the funds, which I think were about $50,000, to the guy's commissary account. At least that part was funny. Can you imagine having that much money on your prison account? A few weeks later, everyone involved, myself included, as well as the prison itself and the company that ran it, were all served with a lawsuit alleging false imprisonment. Oh, Gotta admit, it was an effective tactic. The state was forced to release him pending trial because, as defendants in his lawsuit, it was a conflict of interest to hold him. The guy obviously booked it out of country. A few years later, my boss called me, I had left the company by then, to let me know that the lawsuit against us was dismissed. The nerve! The plaintiff had ended things in a hotel room in Honduras with the help of a rope. Eventually, her missing poster was updated to show that she had been found. Now, only the mother, who was about 19 when the two went missing together, is still listed as missing. CPS doesn't release information regarding minors, so I don't know where she was placed. I heard that the little one was returned to her maternal grandparents. I hope that's true. They may never get their daughter back, but at least they'll have their granddaughter if that's what really happened. After we helped take the little girl away from the man who had been hiding her on a filthy, as she described it, boat in the marina for God knows how long, I hope she at least got a happy ending. Oh my gosh. Well, you are all heroes. This poor little nugget. Oh my gosh, I can't imagine how scared she was. And I mean, just think about just how fate works. Had that deal gone through, maybe, even if you weren't there that day, to have those coloring books ready. Not that it would have been, anybody's fault to not recognize, because I mean, like you said, there was really nothing that looked out of sorts, but it was just the way that all played out for you to color and then have this random conversation, pick up on these very odd comments. She could have been taken away to Honduras and never heard from again. I hope she's with her grandparents and doing okay in life. My mind is just racing to think of what happened and how they got in that situation, where her mom is, and if she's okay. Oh, that was a lot. Thank you again so much for sharing with us, and very happy to hear the update that was on only one off, that time you took your child to a murderer's house. All right, our next story says, Hey Sherilyn and crew, my name is Nick. I'm from Illinois. Yes, I did have to Google the abbreviation for IL and make sure that it was Illinois. This is more for the younger viewers to pay attention when it comes to some adult figures in your life. When I was in high school, my sophomore year, I had a division teacher. I don't know what other cities call their homeroom teachers, but at my high school, it is called the division teacher. Good to know. I was like, what is that? We call them homeroom. His name was Coach A. He was the wrestling coach. He was young, handsome, and all the girls would talk about how fine he was. Anyway, as the year went on, I got to know him and we had a good teacher-student relationship. Then I turned 16. It all started off with a simple, oh, you look nice today. I was a tomboy, so I low-key was suspicious, but didn't think too much of it. Then the question started, did I have brothers? Was my dad around? Did I have any strong male figures in my life? Which no, I didn't. 2, do you have a boyfriend? Did I find him attractive? Was I interested in dating a white man? I'm a person of color. The more info I fed him, he knew I became his perfect candidate for grooming. I was falling for the delusion of us. He started asking me, did I think my parents would like him? Was I a virgin? Would my dad approve of him if we started dating? I was a teenager and unfortunately, I didn't know about grooming. Nobody taught me about it. Rapists, yes, but not the grooming aspect of it. I ended up getting a boyfriend before summer vacation, one of his wrestlers, and he questioned me about him. At 17, I was having issues with my mother, and she found it best that I should live with my father. It was a blessing in disguise, little did I know. I told Coach A what was going on, and on my last day at that high school, we gave each other a long hug goodbye. Like the bell to make it to class, and the late bell rang, we were still hugging. That would be the last time I would ever see him. A few years later, I moved back home and was interested in what he was up to. A buddy of mine and I started investigating like the FBI. That is so relatable. And then we saw it. A newspaper article about how he had been arrested for sleeping with the female students and got 2 of them pregnant. I dodged a bullet. Years went by, but I still didn't grasp what had actually happened to me until I finally went to therapy due to other mental health issues. When my therapist broke it down, I broke down and cried. How can some adults abuse children's trust like that? A lot of people don't understand how that can affect your psyche. Parents, please tell your kids. Teach them about situations like mine so they know the signs to look out for and to tell the proper authorities to get help and justice. Amen. I was having this conversation, I think, with my sister not that long ago. And sometimes when you're thinking back on these situations, especially when you're, in that 16, 17 year age, it's not out of the realm for you to talk with your friends and maybe find a teacher or something like that attractive. But it's that adult's responsibility to not act on that, to not groom you. You are a child, even if in your mind you think you're mature and old enough to handle it. So wrong, so predatory, and it's crazy how many stories are so similar to yours where it's people of authority, people of trust, like teachers who do this. And you're so right. Thank you so much for sharing that. We do need to be aware as parents. I don't think that you think when your child is going to go off to school, the teacher that they might think is good looking is actually acting on that and using that to reel them in. Being equipped with knowing that this can happen to anybody is really important. So thank you. All right, our next story says, "Hello, Sherilyn. I've recently started watching your videos as I've always enjoyed listening to true crime stories. Thank you for using your platform to spread awareness on some stories that most haven't heard of and for giving light to the victims. Most crime channels focus on the person who committed the crime, so it's a nice change for us to remember the victim instead." That's so sweet. Thank you. I'm so glad you enjoy the content. If you were all not receptive to it, I wouldn't be able to do this. So thank you. Anyways, let's begin with the story I have to share today. I want to begin by saying that this isn't my story and happened a few towns over from where I live. This story has stuck with me for years and haunts me as the victim and I were so close in age. Oh, I'm reading ahead and I can see the first line of who this is. Trigger warning. This is a very heavy story. This involves a young girl. This story involves murder of a child, sexual abuse of a child, and child abuse. These are so hard to share. If you need to skip to the next story, that is okay. I absolutely understand. I usually am not strong enough to share child cases, even though I know they're so important too, but we're going to get through this together. Victoria Torrey Strafford was born July 15th, 2000 in Woodstock, Ontario, Canada. My mother, who's a teacher, knows the teacher that taught her, but other than that, I never got to meet her. Those who knew her said she was free-spirited and always had a smile on her face. She loved animals and exploring the outdoor. She was truly a beautiful soul inside and out. Fast forward to April 8th, 2009. Tori left her public school to walk home for the first time by herself. Security cameras caught her walking with a strange woman down the street, and when she failed to come home, her grandmother reported her missing. Tori's home life was a little shaky, as her mother at the time was addicted to drugs, unemployed, and was unable to take care of her properly. I believe her parents were divorced, so her grandmother took over the role of caregiver. Sadly, Tori would go missing for months, and many searches led to no avail. On July 21st, 2009, it was confirmed the remains that were found near Mount Forest, Ontario, belonged to Tori. Please note that this next part contains child abuse and sexual abuse to a child. It's a difficult topic to discuss, and I understand if people need to skip to the next story. One mind, girl. Brace yourselves, and thank you. Thank you for including that trigger warning. So what happened to Tori? On her walk home, she was stopped by a woman called Terry Lynn McClintock. Tori was promised to see a Shih Tzu puppy that Terry Lynn had in a car. I remember the stranger danger talk my parents gave me after this case happened, and to not trust people who promised a puppy. Tori was led away and placed in the backseat floor of the car that Michael Rafferty was in and started to drive, eventually making it to Guelph, Ontario. They pulled into a Home Depot where they purchased garbage bags and a claw hammer. They drove to a secluded area and Terry Lynn exited the car, leaving Michael and Tori alone. As you can imagine, he sexually abused the young girl multiple times. It's said that Tori went on a bathroom break, and Terry Lynn says she remembers Tori telling her not to let him do that again and wouldn't let go of her hand. Oh my God, I feel physically sick. Later, Terry Lynn is said to have used the claw hammer to repeatedly strike Tori over the head, which resulted in her death. Terry Lynn told the court she had beat and murdered Tori because of the pent-up rage from her childhood trauma. I'm definitely not sugarcoating Terry Lynn's actions, but reading up on bits of her childhood, she was severely abused, which got her into drugs as young as 8 years old. She was coasting through life and was always high on some sort of hard drug during her teenage years. Together, Terry Lynn and Michael wrapped her body in garbage bags and covered it in rocks under a tree, where she would later be found by police due to the foul smell in the area. Oh my gosh. Her body showed signs of a beating, which had caused some of her ribs to break, and fractures and lacerations to her liver. There were also signs of internal bleeding. They say she was wearing only a Hannah Montana t-shirt. She loved loved Hannah Montana much like I did at the time, and butterfly earrings she borrowed from her mother. This all happened because Michael had a sick urge to kidnap a young girl, and he roped Terry Lynn, his then girlfriend, to find a young girl to kidnap. The younger they were, the easier they are to manipulate, is what Michael told Terry Lynn. Oh my gosh, I just like, Jurassic jail is too good for these people. The story of Victoria Stafford shook the nation and haunts many to this day. My mother's friend who taught her still mourns her on the anniversary of her disappearance and death. I may not have known her personally, but I will always remember Tori as the kind, bright, and beautiful young girl who impacted so many people's lives in a positive way. Tori had a smile that lit up the sun. She would be 22 today. Thank you for listening. I've also included a picture of Tori here, and oh my gosh, is she not the most precious? I could just never like say on camera so that there was proof of what I would do to people like this. Kids, animals, and the elderly man. You're already messed up if you feel like you got to do this type of stuff to people. That's a whole nother breed. We have to come up with something like harsher than Jurassic jail for these people. Who's that? Okay, the next story says, "Hello, Sherilyn. I am a fairly new viewer to your channel after it came up on my recommendations, and I have been hooked ever since, and I love to watch your channel with my cousins." Well, hello to all of you. I figured I would share my story as a way of therapy and for parents who may have a child who is adverse to a potential step-parent to perhaps reconsider or do more investigating. Because this is a rather lengthy story that needs some backstory, I will also use false names as this man is still alive and my sister is still in touch with him, which has led us to not be on talking terms. So a brief history. When I was around 7 years old, my mother began dating a man named James. When I met James for the first time, I instantly got a bad feeling about him. Even now, anyone who's too nice throws off alarms in my head because they always seem to have the worst skeletons to hide. He was the type that was really nice to people at first, and then once he got comfortable, the mask would come off. I told my mom that I had a bad feeling about him and that he was mean to me when she wasn't around, but she thought I was just being difficult. Sadly, my mother always puts men before her children, but that's a story for another day. Anyways, one of the things James loved to do when my mother wasn't around was fat shame me. I was always big for my age in the sense of height and weight, whereas my sister was rail thin. He would always compare us, which I think is creepy for any man to do to children. Yeah, agreed. And would literally lock me out of the house until it was time for my mother to come home. He would tell me to walk around the apartment complex until I lost weight. Holy. Or sit at the back screen door and make me exercise until I was too tired to continue. As a result, I still hate exercise to this day and have to force myself to do it. He often got mad because he wanted so badly for me to call him dad, but I was very adamant that he was not my father and adamant that everyone knew as well. Good for you. That control, and then to want you to call him that, oh, that's disgusting. Really fired up today. As such, he would find random reasons to punish me, and my mother just went along with it for years. Fast forward to when I'm 16, and my mother is in the midst of a nasty divorce from James. He had been cheating on her, doing drugs in the woods next to our house, and had been manufacturing drugs near our home. He had also attempted to physically abuse my mother. I say attempt because he hit her once and she literally fought him all the way down the street to the police station. My mother had to get a restraining order because he had been stalking her and threatened to kidnap me and my sister from school. Since we were in a small town, everyone knew and would look out for us. One day after the divorce was finalized, my mother had to go to her workplace to pack her things for the summer, and my sister was at a swim meet out of town. I was at home alone, which was no big deal for a teenager. My dogs started to bark like crazy though, like I've never heard them before, so I figured something was wrong. I walked down the hallway from my room towards the main part of the house, and when I looked towards the back door, which we had replaced with a reinforced door because he had tried to break in before, I saw him standing on the deck before he saw me. When he noticed me, I immediately ran for the kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife I could. I also grabbed the cordless phone. He seemed to have left, so I relaxed and called my friend Daniel to see if he could come over because I was pretty spooked, which he agreed. A few minutes later, I hear a knock at the front door, and I was expecting Daniel. Still being spooked, I kept the knife and the phone with me and answered the door, which had a reinforced chain on it as well. It was James, and he immediately tried to push the door in but could not break the chain. He attempted to grab me, but I still had the knife in my hand, and I swiped at him and cut his hand, which just made him angrier. He was close enough that I could smell the alcohol and chemical from whatever drug he was taking on him. His eyes were bulging out of his head, and he was claiming I needed to let him in to get the rest of his stuff. I informed him that we left his possessions with his family and that he was not supposed to be on the property. He again tried to grab me, but I began to kick the door against his arm, which made him back up, and I slammed it closed. I immediately started checking every window and door in the house in a panic. As I'm doing so, I'm watching him circle the house. Our house was up on the ground a little bit, so I was above him, and at the time, I didn't know what he was doing. I knew my mother had recently bought a gun and where she kept it, so I got my dogs and went into her closet. I called 911 and told them about the situation. I mentioned very clearly that I was a kid and that he had threatened to kidnap me before. Even though it was only a few minutes, as I lived close to the police station, it felt like an eternity. I stayed with the operator until the police arrived and were in my house. They had to break down the front door. As per her instructions, I put the gun and knife on the floor in front of me and put my hands up in the air. When the cops were leading me out of the house, I saw that the fire station was there, and I almost vomited at the smell of gasoline. He had tried to flee on foot in the woods, but was soon caught. Long story short, he had been camping in the woods near our house and waiting for me to be home alone. He would later confess that he intended to kill me, then set the house on fire and kill himself. They found a bag with rope, tape, matches, and a gun. This eventually went to trial, and because of my age, my identity was protected. He was only sentenced to 10 years because his family had connections, and even then, he was out after 7 for good behavior. Oh my gosh. I still have nightmares about him, and even had a scare a few years ago because a man that resembled him in a very uncanny way got on the bus I was on. It scared me so badly that I immediately got off at the next stop and had to get my boss to pick me up. Even though I have now transitioned to male and look nothing like I used to, nor do I have the same name, I still worry, even if he apparently does not have the mental capacity to do anything. I beg to differ. It sounds like he's very capable of doing something. As I mentioned before, my sister still has contact with him and says he talks about me, which makes my skin crawl. I have told her she is to never mention me to him or give my information. Even after the trial and everything, she still does not want to believe he's the monster that he was. I do appreciate just taking the time to read my story, even if it's just to yourself. If you do choose to read it on your video, please use my first initial. Thank you for providing an outlet. G. Oh, that was a lot. That immediately made me think of Neale, who is the young woman who killed Dirty John, who was dating her mom or married to her mom. Then when they divorced, he tried to kill her daughter and she was able to kill him. I love what you mentioned at the beginning. Obviously, you know, there is a difference between a child pulling back from a new love interest that they might not be on board with, and that can just be normal. But sometimes, like, when you get those like gut feelings, it's worth at least entertaining for your child's sake and looking in a little bit deeper. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm so glad that you are okay. That story could have gone a lot differently, and I'm sure you know that. All right, our next story says, "Hi Sherilyn, me and my mom watch your videos together all the time." Oh, that's so sweet. I love like when you watch with family. We look forward to every video. I've been debating whether or not the story I have to share would be something you or your viewers would want to read about, but I feel like this story needs to be shared. Even though it's technically not personal to me, it's a very sad one, and I believe there was injustice. I will include how to pronounce some of the words, as this takes place in Wales, UK, and they have some weird spellings. Thank you. You know me well. It actually starts with something strange and paranormal that led to me and my friend investigating a murder that happened in the woods opposite my house about 100 years ago. Me and my friend were just hanging out in my flat, playing around with crystals, tarot, or Ouija boards, and ghost apps, as one does. As we were chatting, my friend had mentioned she was seeing a little 4-year-old boy with her, a ghost. He told her his name and that he didn't feel safe. He also told her he had lost something. Curious, we Googled the name he gave us, and it did in fact come up with some articles. 20th of October, 1888, a 4-year-old little boy, John, was found in the woods. They described the scene as gruesome. I won't go into too much detail, but more can be found online if you only Google the Pondardawi. You did tell me how to pronounce it, and I think I'm doing it right. Pontardawi Ripper. It was believed that John was only there for 24 hours at most. They said he was a victim of a satanic sacrifice because he was found lying on a tree stump with a huge chunk taken out of his butt cheek that they believed the murderer ate. Oh my gosh, I've never heard of this. Little John lived close to the woods, the street over from where my flat currently was. The night before, he was seen on the bridge that entered the woods over a shallow river. He was with 18-year-old Tom. The person who spotted them together had told them to go home as it was getting dark and it wasn't safe. They both said that they would and went on their way. Instantly after this information, the whole community and police blamed Tom, not only because he was the last seen with the little boy, but because he had learning difficulties. I won't include what they called him, but it was a lot of slurs. They claimed Tom admitted to it and sent him to Broadmoor shortly after he was sentenced. Tom was there until the day he died at the age of 85. He was actually the longest inmate, being there for 67 years. However, this didn't make sense to us. Me and my friend don't believe this is the whole story. We lived in the area for a few years, and the details they gave, it didn't make sense to us. So we put our thinking caps on and investigated ourselves. The next day, which strangely enough was October 20th, 2020, when it was light, we downloaded old maps from 1888 and followed them up the woods to where they said John was found. We found the exact tree stump John was found on. It wasn't easy to find as it was old, rotten, and hidden away by overgrown bushes. Looking around, we realized how far it was from the bridge that was also still intact. People had seen Tom and John on, and the stump was actually on the estate of the old mansion. Only a few walls are still there. Their old pool and garden still remains. Oh my gosh, that'd be so creepy. They were the richest family in Pontardawe at the time. I believe they were a family of around 12 people, not including their staff, who also lived there. The fact is important because surely, if a little 4-year-old boy was being unalived just under their window, someone would have heard or seen him. But there's no record to say anyone from the house had witnessed the murder, nor even knowing that John was laying unalived on their property before he was found by police from the community searching for him. This seems very unlikely. I know I would have noticed if there was a toddler murdered in my garden. This was also a private estate, so surely they would have had some sort of security measures in place, not letting just anybody walk into their home. After more investigating, we had found out on the land, in the garden, there were unmarked graves. First, we thought there may have been family members, but after further looking, there was a separate graveyard with stones with every single family member's name on it. We know this as there's information signs in the woods where their mansion used to be, introducing the family because they're still very looked up to. So our question is, who do these unmarked graves belong to? And why aren't they spoken about more? What was this family up to? And did they have some dark secrets? I also want to know these answers. We looked around the land some more, following the old maps, and realized that the time they said Tom got home and what time little John had approximately died, he would have not gotten back that fast. You girls need your own business. Although it was close by, without the current path we now have, he would have had to climb down a steep cliff and even swim through the local river in order to get back to his house for the time that they claimed. By the timing, it seemed as though when he was told to go home by that passerby, he had done just that, but little John had gone off on his own or with somebody else. More research showed he had spoken to his mother when he returned home, but she had never reported seeing anything strange. He didn't have any blood on him, which he would have if he just brutally unalived a little boy a few minutes prior, nor were his clothes wet, so he wouldn't have swam nor cleaned himself off in the river. Looking more into Tom, we realized through research he had the mind of a young boy himself. He was physically 18, but mentally he was around the same age as John. Even if he had hurt John, he would not have thought about cleaning himself up before returning home. He wouldn't have even thought about taking the little boy to somewhere out of the way before hurting him. The likely reason Tom was even with John that day was probably just to play with him, like children do. We deeply believed Tom was framed, and it could have possibly been someone from the rich family, but it was just easier to pin it on the disabled boy because he wasn't capable of defending himself. If you read the articles in court, they even said Tom had no understanding on what was going on, while still insulting him. They were very clear Tom was told to admit to the crime, to tell them where he had left the knife used. This doesn't make sense in the timing either, It was apparently on the windowsill at the place Tom worked, but how could he have murdered a toddler, got rid of the weapon, and gotten home within minutes? This knife was also found with only little blood on it. They never confirmed if it was even John's blood. I wonder if they would have even been able to back then. Tom agreed with what they were telling him he had done. Then he asked to go home, which shows he didn't understand what was going on, yet they still sent him away. Ooh, that reminds me of Brendan Dassey. I know a lot of people are conflicted on that case, but this really sounds similar. In this article, they also accused Tom of previously harming animals and threatening his mother, even though no one could actually confirm this. Unfortunately, even though Broadmoor will keep his files until 2055, there's no way of accessing them. No way to know what the rest of Tom's life was like, if he was safe or mistreated, or if he ever spoke about that night in any more detail. As us true crime lovers know, Broadmoor is a very well-known place to send criminals who are mentally unwell, and things definitely went on inside those walls. Our question is what? Why is there public records released about other criminals and what they were up to in there, but not for Tom? What are they hiding about him? It was even made very clear they will never release his files and that they will be destroyed in 2055. We may never know the truth. Ooh, we need to get on this. This is a mystery that keeps me up at night. I'm alongside you now. I can't stop thinking about both those boys and how much they both deserved better. John deserves justice. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, something led us to his story that day, and his spirit was unhappy. He didn't feel safe, and he was lost. Maybe getting the truth out there will help him move on. Tom also deserved better. His life was also taken away from him, all because he had learning difficulties. He needed compassion, but all he received was abuse from authorities. I just hope that he was cared for in Broadmoor. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask, because I'm not sure if I got everything in this email. I didn't want to make it too long. And whether or not you read this in your channel, thank you for taking the time to get this far. The boys deserve to have their story told. Holy cannoli! This is outrageous. I've never heard this, and now I am going to lose sleep. I will probably be emailing you theories. We've got to get to the bottom of this. Both these boys. Thank you so much for sharing this. Also, you're incredible. If you and your friend are not in the field of investigating and solving crimes, you should be. All right, our final story today. This isn't a true crime story, but it's a tragedy my family has been going through for over a year now, and all we want is justice for our sweet baby girl. We want her story to catch some traction so we can hopefully push harder and find the help we need to get her the justice she deserves, and to hold the people responsible for her death accountable for their actions, or lack thereof, and for being negligent to the point that a precious little life was cut way too short. We hope to spread awareness so other families don't have to go through the same thing we are, and so they will know what to look out for, to trust their instincts, and advocate for their children, because nobody else will, as we so unfortunately found out. On March 20th, 2021, my 6-month-old daughter, Emelina, started acting strange. We were on the bed together, and she was wiggling around and trying to crawl like she normally would, when she suddenly rolled over onto her back, and her eyes started to roll around in an unnatural manner. Her breathing was also very labored and shallow. I picked her up immediately, and she was limp, dead weight in my arms. Her arms and head dangled as if she was unconscious. This was very alarming to me. I immediately handed her to her father and told him to get in the back seat of my car and hold her on the way to Kaiser's urgent care on Stockdale Highway. I told him not to put her in her car seat and instead hold her so that he could monitor her breathing. By the time we arrived at the urgent care, Emelina was acting like herself again. She was aware and smiling and moving normally. Regardless, her father took her in and told him what had happened to her just a few minutes previously. He explained that she was seemingly going unconscious and that her breathing had gotten very shallow to the point where we were too afraid to put her in her car seat for the drive over. I was unable to go in because they only allowed one parent to accompany a minor patient. I stayed with my 2 older children, and we drove to a nearby Valley Strong bank to make a withdrawal. After leaving the bank, we went back to the urgent care, and Emelina had already been discharged. This took approximately 30 minutes. When her father strapped her into the car seat and got back into the car, he told me that the doctor saw Emelina and said she merely had the beginnings of an ear infection. He told me he reiterated to the doctor that she was acting as if she was going unconscious and was having trouble breathing just a few minutes prior, to which the doctor said that it was completely normal for babies to act that way from time to time. The doctor's explanation consisted of looking into Emelina's nose, her ears, as well as listening to her breathing with a stethoscope. Despite her father expressing our concerns, the doctor did not order any type of lab or testing. We thought since he had brought her up her breathing twice, they would at least do a chest x-ray, being that we were in the middle of a pandemic in which an illness attacks your lungs and babies cannot speak for themselves, but he did not. He wrote her a prescription for amoxicillin to treat an ear infection and sent her home. On April 5th, 2021, the day she turned 7 months old, and 16 days after her urgent care visit in the early afternoon, Emelina stopped breathing. Earlier, she was sitting on my grandpa's lap in the living room. I was supposed to be taking him to the Kia dealership to pick up his car after a repair. Once my grandfather was ready to get up and get dressed, I picked up Emelina. I remember this so vividly. As I picked her up, she smiled so big and so bright at me, and I smiled back at her. I carried her to my bedroom and handed her to her father so I could get dressed to take my grandfather to pick up his car. I saw him cradle her and offer her a bottle, which she took. As I was getting ready to leave, Emelina's father got up and laid her down on the bed, propping the bottle up for her. I watched as she drank a few gulps before turning away from her bottle and turning over on her hands and knees. She began to wiggle around, trying to crawl. She had been learning to crawl for a few weeks at this point, but wasn't quite there yet. But she was getting so close. At times when she was wiggling and scooting around, she would tire herself out and put her head down and drift off to sleep on her stomach with her knees tucked beneath her. I watched as she did this before, and I walked out of the door to take my grandfather to pick his car up. As I was approaching the dealership to drop my grandfather off, my phone rang. It was Emelina's father. So I answered. He told me that in the 15 minutes since I had left the house, he found Emelina not breathing, tried to wake her, called 911, and began CPR. Oh my gosh, I can't imagine. By the time he called me, the ambulance was already there to transport her to Kern Medical Center on the corner of Mount Vernon and Flower Street. I rushed home as fast as I could, and when I pulled up to the house, I was surrounded by multiple Kern County Sheriff vehicles. As I got out of the car, an officer approached and told me that my daughter was no longer breathing and had to be taken to CMC for treatment. I dropped to my knees in hysterics. The officers told me that nobody was permitted to enter the house, and they questioned us. As they questioned us, I asked if we could please go to the hospital to check on our daughter, to which they said we were able. We got into the car and rushed to KMC. Once inside, they put us in a tiny room with chairs and said somebody would be in to speak with us. After what felt like an eternity of pacing and hyperventilating and the worst anxiety I had ever experienced, a doctor along with a nurse finally opened the door. They told us that my daughter was in very critical condition and they couldn't tell me whether or not she would recover. They were not equipped to deal with the trauma of this capacity, so they arranged to have her transported to Valley Children's Hospital in Madera County by helicopter. They led us into the room where they had her lying in a gurney. Her eyes were open but not responsive, and she felt cold. Oh my gosh. The only thing doctors at KMC did for Emelina before her transport arrived was adding drops to her eyes to keep them moist and sending in the chaplain to pray for her. Of course, she was hooked up to an IV and monitors, and someone from the sheriff's office came to take photos of my baby with a name card on her belly as if she was already gone right in front of me. But that was the extent of what happened at KMC. After a few of the hardest hours of my life, her transportation to Valley Children's Hospital arrived. There were so many sheriff's officers, as well as hospital staff and transport team members, that it was hard for me to be able to see what was happening. But once they got her moved onto the transport gurney, I heard a woman who was there to transport her ask, "Why is this baby's internal temperature 43 degrees? Then she started taking charge and shouting commands. She was the first person who seemed to really want to help my baby girl. She demanded heating blankets and other equipment to help Emelina's temperature, and as quickly as they arrived to transport her, they were gone. I wouldn't see my daughter again for hours. The helicopter left Kern Medical Center around 5 or 6 o'clock the evening of April 5th, 2021. Emelina's father and I got into our car and followed as closely as we could, not wanting her to be alone. We arrived at the hospital that night, I believe somewhere around 9 o'clock. We went to the place we were directed, the pediatric intensive care unit, and buzzed at the door. We were told to sit in the waiting room until a doctor, again accompanied by a nurse, took us into a room and told us that our daughter was more than likely not going to be leaving the hospital. They explained how she had been without oxygen for an extended period of time and how that had affected her brain. They, however, did not tell us that she had coded upon arrival. We found that out much later on when we received her medical records. We asked if we could see her, and we were told she was having tests done that would probably take a while, but they would call us as soon as we were able to see her. We slept between crying and hyperventilating in hysterics in the car right outside the hospital. We finally got a call from them in the early hours of April 6, 2021 to let us know that Emelina was in her room and that we could go up to see her. When we walked into her room, we saw her hooked up to everything she possibly could be. She had wires all over her head, PICC lines, IVs in her arms and hands, tubes in her nose and mouth. All we could do was hold her hand and try to rub her head, avoiding all the wires in her hair. The morning of the 6th of April 2021, we were introduced to the doctor who would be taking over care of Emelina. She was very upfront and matter-of-fact in her prognosis. She informed us that our girl was in fact going to die. Oh my gosh. She advised us to call any family members that would like to come and say goodbye to her. She told us that they were giving her medication to keep her heart pumping until everyone got the chance to see her, but that if she decided to go sooner, they were not going to attempt to revive her. Nobody presented us with a DNR, nor did anyone ever mention it. They made it seem as though we had no choice in the matter. They did revive her once during the late morning of April 6th because her father and I were not in the room when her heart stopped. We ran it as fast as we could, and the doctor told us she would not do it again as it would only cause further trauma. The family members came and said their goodbyes. Towards the end, they brought a bigger bed in so I could lay with her one last time. Then she was slipping away. Her father sat down to hold her for the last time, then traded seats with me so I could do the same, and I held her as she took her final breaths. And the life drained from her tiny body. She was pronounced deceased just before midnight on April 6, 2021. We headed back home to Bakersville the next morning. On the drive home, I received a call from the coroner. My daughter was going to the coroner's case, so I had no say in what happened to her body during the time they had her. Valley Children's Hospital had a few social workers speak with us while we were there to inform us that they were going to open a case to investigate Emelina's death to make sure that what happened was not done intentionally. They told us that they would be doing a full body x-ray and multiple other scans and tests to look for any signs of abuse or neglect. Of course, they found none. We got home on April 7th, 2021 around noon. No sooner than we got out of our car and laid down to cry and mourn the loss of our baby together, a social worker knocked on our front door. She did a walkthrough of our house and scheduled an appointment for her to come back and speak with us a couple days later when our 2 other children would also be present. Of course, our case was closed and any accusations of abuse or neglect were deemed unfound. From the time Emelina stopped breathing until approximately 8 weeks later, we still had no answer as to what happened to our beautiful baby girl. From the time the ambulance took her to Kern Medical Center until she took her last breath, nobody could give us any answers. Every doctor, nurse, or other medical professional we came into contact with simply told us that they didn't know why or how this happened to Emelina, despite doing extensive testing during her stay at Valley Children's Hospital. We had no answers as to what had happened or why it happened to our baby for weeks. It was agony, until finally one late-night phone call came from the coroner. She told me that the doctor's report from my daughter's autopsy had just landed on her desk, and she thought that it was best to call even though it was late, to finally give us an answer as to what took our baby from us. Acute bilateral lobar pneumonia. This was the coroner's findings. My sweet baby girl was suffering from pneumonia and apparently had been for some time before her death. When I requested her medical records from every entity that had been in contact with her, I had no problems receiving them except for Valley Children's Madeira. I requested all of her records and lab tests and radiographic images from the beginning of her stay until the end. I waited weeks to hear back from them, and when I did, it was in the form of a letter denying any and all access to her records pursuant to Health and Safety Code Section 123115A. 2. The hospital may restrict or deny access to parts of the medical records when the healthcare provider determines that access to the patient's record request by the representative would have a detrimental effect on the provider's professional relationship with the minor patient or the minor's physical safety or psychological well-being, which I had trouble understanding. Yes, because my daughter had already passed and the relationship between her and the doctor as well as her physical safety and psychological well-being were no longer factors. Agreed. In confusion, I reached out to the hospital's patient representative line, and I also filed a complaint with the Fresno Department of Health Services. When one of the Valley Children's patient representatives reached out to return my call, we talked about the possible reasons the doctor would deny my request for Emelina's records. We decided that it was more likely due to the CPS case that was opened while she was in their care, or possibly the investigation with the Kern County Sheriff's Department with Detective Eric Loera. However, by the time I had requested these records, both cases had been closed and were cleared of any suspicion of involvement in Emelina's death. The representative informed me that the doctor would have received the same letter stating so from both CPS and the Kern County Sheriff's Department, so the doctor would have been aware that these cases were no longer factors that could restrict my access to my child's medical records. The representative got in contact with the doctor to find out why she denied my request. And when she called me back, she informed me that she was able to get a partial approval from the doctor for a portion of Emelina's records, but that if I wished to receive anything further or full medical transcripts, that I would have to do so by subpoena of the court. I still have not received full access to Emelina's records, including radiographic images from the Valley Children's Madeira. Wow. We were treated as if we were under suspicion the entirety of the hospital stay, despite being 100% cooperative and compliant in any and every step of the hospital deemed necessary. And were then denied full access to our baby girl's records for a reason that remains unknown. We also now know that Emma's medical records from Kaiser are incorrect. In that record from the urgent care visit, the first one, states only the doctor's diagnosis and opinion. Not only do they not state any of our concerns of parents, any triage information, or the list of symptoms given to the registration nurse for the reason for her visit, but the records state the exact opposite. They state that there were no reports of breathing concerns or any other respiratory symptoms. For this reason, I cannot find a lawyer to take my case. Because Kaiser lied on my baby's medical records, nobody will even consider moving forward due to the fact that they don't believe they will be able to prove Emma's symptoms on that day because Kaiser falsified her medical records. To date, I have done anything and everything to try to get her justice, most recently filing an amendment of medical records with Kaiser. I've been fighting a hard fight for a year while also grieving the loss of my beautiful little ray of sunshine, and this has been the hardest fight of my life. I feel helpless and hopeless and defeated, and now all I want is her story to be heard, even if she never gets the justice she deserves. To let parents know to push for the care their children deserves, to advocate for those who can't advocate for themselves, to be a voice for the voiceless. I did what I believed I needed to do for my baby by taking her to Kaiser's urgent care the moment I felt something was wrong, and then following the doctor's orders and giving her the medication that he had prescribed for her, and the doctor's laziness in not doing and testing or providing labs on her caused this illness to go undiagnosed and therefore untreated. That doctor sent my sweet baby home to suffer and die from a treatable, very survivable illness. This is the story of my daughter's tragic, untimely, and preventable death. Our family is broken as we try to navigate life without our little angel. My children are exposed to the concept of death, which no 5 or 6-year-old should ever have to comprehend, as we try to explain why their baby sister is never coming home again. They are traumatized after seeing her turn blue and watching their father perform CPR on her small body as she coughed up formula from her mouth and nose. None of this needed to happen. Emelina should still be here with us. And now, in the wake of her death, all we want is for nothing like this to ever happen to another baby who cannot speak for themselves. No more senseless, unnecessary, and preventable deaths of children. It was the doctor's job to find out what was ailing Emelina and speak for her, diagnose her, and treat her. Babies cannot speak for themselves, so we must do it for them. We must advocate for those who cannot advocate for themselves. Justice must be served for Emelina as well as all the other children who have lost their lives to medical negligence. Emma was such a beautiful, bright, and wonderful soul. She deserved better than this. Thank you for taking the time to read Emelina's story. Melissa Plant. Oh my gosh, my heart is just shattered. Thank you for bringing attention to this story. You're so right. I mean, I just have goosebumps just processing how much trust we put into others, especially to advocate for our little ones who, like you said, can't speak for themselves. And I can't imagine what you're going through. For everybody watching, Melissa has a GoFundMe. It's under the name Legal Expenses for Emma's Case. The organizer is Emma's mother, Melissa. If you want to reach out and contribute, I will leave the link for you to do so. I'm so sorry for your family's loss. Thank you for sharing this to raise awareness. I hope you find justice, and I hope this story ensures that something like this doesn't happen to another baby and family. That is our final story of the day. I'm sending so much love, prayers, support, hugs, screen squeezes to everybody who sent something in, and thank you to everybody who listens, watches, comments, and sends love, because it's so needed and I know appreciated. I will see you in the next video. I will miss you terribly. Until then, make sure to love each other, love yourself, and I will see you soon. Bye.